doing? It's like 20 degrees out here. Jesus.
Even I have limits. No, I'm not gonna do that. It freaking snowed down here. Do you have any idea how often it snows in Florida? No, Oh. Hi. Welcome to another episode of Judge of Character. As always, I'm your host, Steve. So last week we talked about Solid Snake, the main character from the Metal Gear franchise, and one of the sneakiest bastards ever. But while Solid Snake is the primary character of the franchise and the most oft-remembered character in the series, he's not the only one worth talking about. The franchise is filled to bursting with characters of all kinds, with in-depth backstories and well-written personalities. I could devote an entire mini-series to just about every character in every game. But I am trying to fix my issue with focus, so let's keep things in perspective here. Now I'm going to go ahead and warn you that all of the main parts I talked about with Solid Snake can also apply to Big Boss, so I'm not going to cover them again here. If you really want to learn more about that, just go watch the Solid Snake episode. It's pretty much the same elements. What I am going to cover here are the comparisons and contrasts between the two, as they are very similar characters, and more importantly, how Big Boss has been portrayed throughout the series. So, without wasting more time, let's learn more about the Legend of Legends, Big Boss. For the longest time, Solid Snake was considered to be the main hero of the series, and the primary villain of the series, at least until Metal Gear Solid 2, was Big Boss, Snake's genetic father, aka cloning material, and the man known as the greatest warrior of all time. As I stated in the previous episode, Big Boss was the main baddie for the first two Metal Gear games, with both of them ending with you facing the man in one-on-one. In Metal Gear Solid, the role of Big Bad was taken up by Liquid Snake, Solid Snake's brother and another clone of Big Boss. The man himself was physically absent from the game, but his presence was still strongly felt, as it was Big Boss's legacy as a soldier that drove Liquid to his actions in an attempt to become greater than Big Boss. Metal Gear Solid 2 also has the looming specter of Big Boss in the form of Solidus Snake, a third clone who is attempting to overthrow a mysterious organization known as the Patriots. Confused yet? Too bad, we got a lot more ground to cover. Who are the Patriots? That's a question I can't answer without both spoiling the entire franchise and spreading the episode out to over 3 hours. Bottom line, the Patriots are the true villains of the entire series, having been involved in almost every game in some form, and are much more complicated than you're initially led to believe. Seriously, it takes roughly 3 games to explain all of the finer points of who and what the Patriots are. And even now, I still find myself scratching my head over the finer points of it all. But you're probably wondering, if the Patriots are the true villains of the story, what does that make Big Boss? Short answer, quite possibly one of the better examples of a tragic hero. Why hero and not villain? Well, hopefully after this is over, you'll know. The story of Big Boss actually begins with the game Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater. When the game was first shown, many people were quick to catch on to the fact that this game seemed to take place at an earlier time in history. They were right, of course, as MGS3 is in fact a prequel to all of the other games that came before. Chronologically speaking, MGS3 is the very first game in the series, showing a much younger Big Boss, back when he was known as Naked Snake. The plot of the game involved Snake being sent into the USSR to retrieve a Soviet scientist named Sokolov, who's defecting to the US.
America!
But all does not go well when Snake's mentor, the Boss, who's been providing support so far, suddenly defects to the USSR, beats the shit out of Snake, complete with throwing him off of a bridge, and then kidnaps Sokolov back for the bad guys of the game, namely Colonel Volgin, a heavily scarred man who apparently thinks he's the Thunder God Raiden. I still have no idea what the hell that noise is supposed to be. Anyway, this is a major turn of events, both for the character as well as the story. Much like how Big Boss would later become a mentor and father figure to Solid Snake in the future, the Boss is a mentor and mother figure to Naked Snake in the past, thus drawing our first parallel between the two characters. After recovering from his injuries, Snake is later sent back into the USSR with a new mission. In order to clean up relations between America and the Soviets, Snake is charged with stopping the renegade faction of soldiers led by our Raiden wannabe, destroying the pre-Metal Gear, known as the Shagohod, and then finally eliminating the Defector and his former mentor, the Boss. What follows is an action-packed story filled with too many awesome and emotional moments to count. The heart of it all is the interplay between Snake and the Boss. Even when she's beating his ass, there's a connection between the two that can best be described as familial. It really does feel like a mother-son connection, even when things are at their darkest. It all culminates in what could arguably be one of the most gut-punching moments in the game, maybe even gaming history.
You may want to have tissues handy.
After beating the Boss for the last time, we're treated to a cinematic showing them having one last moment together. Knowing you still have a mission to complete, the Boss hands you her Patriot submachine gun and tells you to finish her, stating that there can be only one Boss and one Snake. And, in one of the most heart-wrenching moments ever, the game hands control over to you for that one fateful shot.
Bear in mind, this is a series that's been known to be as much of a full movie as a game. And to suddenly be handed control of what could be the single most depressing moment in the entire franchise, it can be too much to handle.
Seriously, the game will not continue until you push the button and pull the trigger, or after enough time passes. If you refuse to do what has to be done, the game eventually does it for you. Of course, most people don't realize this the first time around and end up pulling the trigger themselves, leading to quite a few broken souls. If you don't feel anything by the time you reach this scene, you have no soul. In fact, this scene is brilliant in how it hands control over to the player at that crucial moment, essentially implicating them in the death of the Boss, and by extension, having a hand in turning Naked Snake into the villainous Big Boss we'd come to know later in the series. It's an excellent meta version of creating your own enemy in a way. Overall, Metal Gear Solid 3 is the perfect example of the biggest element of the character, his portrayal throughout the series. As far back as the very first Metal Gear, we were led to believe that he was just another power-hungry villain out for global domination. Then Metal Gear Solid 3 came out, and all of a sudden we were seeing him in a completely brand new light. It's made even worse when we learn, in the same game no less, that the Boss wasn't a traitor to her own country. Her supposed defection and eventual execution by her own student was all part of a very large and complex plan that really only served to allow the US to save face with the commies. It's upon learning this truth that he was essentially used only to further the goals of the government that Snake, who has now earned the title of Big Boss, becomes disillusioned with it all. This is the moment that will eventually lead to his attempting to create a place for soldiers to live in peace, what would later be known as Outer Heaven and then Zanzibar Land. These attempts to create separate nations just for soldiers we later learn were his attempt to fight back against these oh-so-mysterious patriots we learned about before. In essence, even as a villain, Big Boss was still technically a hero. He just went about it the wrong way.
Now, the more attentive among you might have noticed there are quite a few parallels between both Big Boss and Solid Snake. One of these parallels is the relationships they have with their mentors, and how much these relationships mirror each other. But even these have differences. Whereas Big Boss still has nothing but devotion and respect for the Boss years later, Solid Snake's relationship with Big Boss is a little more tenuous, shall we say. They don't end up patching things up until the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, and that's as Big Boss is dying.
Another parallel between the two is their personal histories and how they react. As you can now tell, both men have gone through some seriously fucked up shit. But the difference is how they react to these events. Solid Snake at first does the same things as Big Boss, but unlike Big Boss, who mostly remains unchanged in his cynicism and attitude, Snake eventually loses this attitude and learns to live again, even getting a chance at peace. Big Boss doesn't get this until the very end, right before his true and final death.
One interesting contrast between the two characters is how they evolve over time. No doubt both men do grow and evolve over the course of the games, but when it comes to who's better, I gotta go with Big Boss. That's not to say that Solid Snake doesn't evolve or change, it's just that over the course of the games, he still has quite a few traits and a personality that, well, we all automatically recognize as him. With Big Boss, it's much more dynamic. Over the course of the whole franchise, we see him go from villain to hero to tragic fallen character. It's just simply amazing. This is the other memorable aspect of the character. Big Boss is much more dynamic, always changing and shifting with each new game that comes out with him as the lead. This makes him a more interesting character to the public. He has much more gravity with his character than Solid Snake, making him just as much of a great memorable character as his clone. Now before I wrap all this up, there's one more thing I need to cover in relation to both characters. David fucking Hayter. That gravelly voice that sounds like someone who smoked several packs a day and washed them all down with extremely generous swigs of whiskey? Yeah, you can thank this guy. David Hayter is known by fans all over the world as the voice of Solid Snake, essentially making him Snake himself. Why do I bring him up? At least a sizable part of both Solid Snake and Big Boss's status as badass characters can be attributed to that voice.
Liar. That nervous glance. That scared look in your eyes. They're rookies' eyes if I ever saw them. You've never shot a person, am I right?
I mean, come on, that's the voice of a badass if ever there was one. It's not just that the voice is badass. Hayter lends a certain weight to the characters. It's this sort of world-weary, tired, and yet slightly filled with hope weight that just adds nothing but dimension to the characters. Metal Gear Solid 4 is yet again a good example of this. By this game, Snake's voice is as old as he is in appearance, and it's filled with that same tiredness that befits the entirety of the game.
You still have your youth. Don't waste it. You can start over. From here on, this is my fight. We tore the world apart. Made your life a living hell.
In addition, Big Boss's voice, as done by voice actor Richard Doyle, is also perfect. It's a voice that's old, worn, and full of remorse and sadness of a past long since gone.
Oh, it's not about changing the world.
To not mention this one element about the characters would be a crime in and of itself. In fact, many fans of the games are so devoted to David Hayter as Snake that when news broke that Kiefer Sutherland would be replacing him in Metal Gear Solid 5, well, let's just say it was a dark time for the world.
Stay in your seat.
Yeah. So, what makes Big Boss a memorable character? In addition to all of the elements that he shares with his son and clone Solid Snake, Big Boss is a memorable character due to how he's handled. His story arc throughout the series is nothing short of heartbreaking, and to see how this man went from being a hero to a villain speaks volumes about the series overall, and about Kojima's skill as a writer. I still sometimes think that he pulled a lot of these plot lines out of his ass, but even if he did, he wove them all together beautifully and ended up giving us two of the most truly awesome and epic characters to ever grace our controllers. While I still consider Big Boss to be the greater of the two, they are both memorable characters in their own right. Period. Now, in case you're wondering, yes, I do plan on covering the boss, but that'll be in a later episode. Trust me, a character like her deserves to be talked about and praised. In any case, thanks for joining me on this journey, and I hope to see you next time. As always, I'm your host Steve, reminding all of you to stay in character.
Petals of white cover fields flowing in grieving tears, and all the hearts once new, owned and shattered. just wonder why. Cold as a dog, now my words are frosted with every breath. Still the hate burns wild, growing inside this heart. When the wind changes course, when the stars align, I will reach out to you and leave this all behind. When heavens divide. When heavens divide, I will see the choices within my hands. How can we ever protect and fight with our tiny souls? Let me shine like the sun through the doubts and fear. Do you feel the storm approach as the end draws near? When heavens divide, time will come to softly lay me down. Then I can see a face that I long to see. And for you, oh will, I would give anything, leaving a trace for love to find a way. When heavens divide.